report for the Department of Justice released this week found that the Memphis Police Department uses excessive force and discriminates against black people. The investigation was launched after the death of Tyree Nichols after a traffic stop in 2023. The investigation began 6 months after Nichols was kicked, punched, and hit with a police baton as 5 officers tried to arrest him after he fled a traffic stop. Let's watch the video from the Memphis Police, and note, some may find the video disturbing.
You gonna get your ass blown the off. Get the cup. Get the cup. Damn, I didn't do anything. Hey, I didn't turn your ass around. All right. On the ground.
The report says that, quote, Memphis police officers regularly violate the rights of the people they are sworn to serve. It went further and said that the Memphis police show, quote, a pattern or practice of excessive force and routinely exhibited discrimination against black people and those with behavioral health disabilities. The report revealed that a black person was 13 times more likely to be stopped. That means the police department routinely conducted racial profiling by making unlawful stops, searches, and arrests.
Despite these findings, officials in Memphis, Tennessee have pushed back against calls for greater oversight of the city's police department. In a news conference on Thursday, Mayor Paul Young said the city has been taking steps to address police abuses. He pushed back against the city entering a binding agreement with the federal government, which is known as a consent decree.
We believe we can make more effective and meaningful change by working together with community input and independent national experts than we can with a bureaucratic, costly, and complicated federal government consent decree.
The death of Tyree Nichols and the subsequent findings go to the heart of tensions facing police and policing around the nation. There's been more reporting on the persecution of black people by police since Black Lives Matter, which erupted in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd.
All right, so interesting report here. There has been pushback from officials in Memphis. Notably, the chief legal officer for the city, Tanera Gibson, claimed that because the investigation only took 17 months to complete as opposed to an average of 2 to 3 years, that she feels that there was a rush to judgment. And I would note that she is black as well as the 5 officers who were involved in that tragic death of Tyree Nichols. So based on what I've read of the report so far, I'm not sure that it fully establishes that there is racial discrimination happening with the Memphis Police Department, which is over 50% black in terms of the officer makeup. Is there police abuse? Probably. I'm sure there is in every city. But I would stop short of agreeing with the Department of Justice conclusion that this is a racially motivated issue and not a power issue.
Well, people, including this Justice Department report, they're certainly pointing to race, but they're also pointing to people with disabilities. And so I think as so many of these stories try to get weaponized, it's talked about in terms of race, but also in terms of what they're describing as behavioral health issues and people with disabilities. The report did find that an 8-year-old black boy with behavioral health issues was grabbed by the responding police officer, lifted into the air, and thrown onto a couch. They're handcuffing children as young as 8 years old as well. So we are seeing some abuses that are very troubling. And I think when you zoom out and look at police departments around the country, there has been a very important conversation about how they can reform their practices. Now, being the job of a police officer is extremely difficult. I have friends who are police officers. The one thing they tell me all the time is that they wish they had more training. They had more resources for training. They're constantly in these very difficult, very sensitive and emotional situations. It has a huge impact on the police officers personally. But there are constructive bipartisan solutions to address this issue. And I think, as this report is pointing out, there is excessive force. I think one example of excessive force is chokeholds. And I think I've seen some interesting left-right alignment around reforming the practice of chokeholds in many police departments, and there are other opportunities as well. So I hope that this whole investigation sprung from the Tyree Nichols case, and I'm glad they're looking into it further.
Sure, yeah, and I definitely am often concerned about conversations to reform the police, because sometimes we get to conversations like defund the police, which are hugely counterproductive.
Yeah.
If you want police to behave better in these fraught situations, then the question would be about training and potentially more funding, not less. Why are you going to take away the resources that they need to make sure that they're hiring the best officers and training good people? What happens when you remove funding from police departments is they end up hiring people who are less qualified for the job, and you actually are exacerbating the exact issues that you're trying to get rid of. And there's been a lot of conversation about how police do deal with people with disabilities, particularly mental disabilities, because they're often going into situations where someone could be having a mental health crisis or something similar, where things escalate very quickly. And there's been talk about de-escalation tactics. One of the issues that I've heard from police officers is they have a lot of concern about some of the alternative solutions that have been suggested for this, which is to send in mental health professionals instead of police officers. And although they may be better trained in de-escalation tactics, one of the concerns is if a situation does turn violent, are you then putting someone who is a mental health professional but not trained to handle potentially violent situations in a situation where they could end up getting hurt? And then if they're even accompanied by a police officer, they now have two people that they're concerned about rather than just the one.
Yeah, way too often in America, we're asking police officers to be social service workers, and that's not what they're trained for. That's not what they're supposed to be doing. And we certainly need the mental health support, social service workers who can do those things, and police do the things that they're trained to do. You mentioned de-escalation. That's another area that I'm seeing interesting alignment between left and right, is more training around de-escalation. That's something that a number of police officers are calling for right now. And another solution that's come out is developing a registry of essentially bad cops in America, because one thing that happens is you have a bad cop who uses excessive force, is discriminatory perhaps in one police department, but then they move to a different police department, perhaps in a different state, and they might not be aware of some of those issues. And so if you can share that information across police departments across the country, that can be helpful as well, and that's getting bipartisan support.
Yeah, I mean, that should seem pretty obvious to me. And I have to say, one of the reasons why I think this has become such a fraught partisan issue is because of the rise of Black Lives Matter, particularly in 2020, because they were one of the groups pushing the defund the police solution, as they put it. And I think they created a lot of unnecessary fear and really exaggerated fear about the police, which has made it harder for both police to do their jobs and for citizens to feel like they can trust the police and have a good relationship with them. You have a majority of Democrats who believe that the number of unarmed Black men who are killed each year by police is in the thousands. It's like a dozen. I mean, one is too many, sure. But even if you look at the Washington Post database of police shootings of unarmed Black men, and that 12 to 14 number that's been consistent from 2014 to 2024, you see that if you actually look at the individual cases, a significant portion of them attacked the police officer before they were shot. So even if they didn't have a gun or a knife, they were still maybe trying to beat this police officer or take their sidearm, for example. And so you end up getting down to about 5 cases where there was an actually unjustified shooting, and there's maybe 4 out of 5 where the officer was ultimately held accountable for their actions. Again, if there's one where the police officer didn't face accountability, that's bad and we should fix that. But I also think it's important for us not to overstate the problem, because that just creates this really fraught, tense relationship between police and civilians when I think, generally speaking, both of those groups are trying to do the best they can.
They're trying to, and I think the more they can build community relations, community policing is really important. Interestingly, some of the areas where you see the least support for defunding the police is from primarily Black and brown communities in places like my hometown of Milwaukee. Now, I can also think about some of the activists who called in the wake of George Floyd defunding the police. Now, a lot of activists, they kind of get their talking points from social media, and it becomes kind of a slogan. And for policymakers, making policy based on slogans, not a good idea. And there's a lot of support for actually refunding the police right now. But some of the spirit, just to add a little bit more context to the defund the police, was also about this issue of police officers being asked to do things that they don't do or aren't trained to do. Like, you really need more social support for people who are dealing with drug addiction or mental health challenges. We need to fund those services as well. That was some of the spirit that I heard from my friends who are active in the defund the police movement. Now, some of those same people who were calling for defund the police, not so much talking about that right now. Unfortunately, Kamala Harris was one of those individuals, and she has absolutely paid the price for that. So part of the other thing I'll just quickly point to here is in the wake of George Floyd, there was initially a constructive process in Congress for a justice and policing reform legislation. And unfortunately, what happened with that quickly was it got sucked into this polarization vortex where people who are driving that bill wanted it to be a partisan issue. They wanted it to be only a Democratic issue. And even when they had the opportunity to get some constructive ideas from Republicans, people like Senator Tim Scott, for example, they said, we actually don't want to hear your ideas. Well, so then the question becomes, are you here to make a statement or are you here to solve the problem? Because there really are quite a bit of bipartisan ideas that are out there, but unfortunately it's easier to keep the issue on the ballot than to actually solve it.
Yeah, they want that political win as opposed to actually trying to create a better outcome for the American people. It's all too common, unfortunately, in our politics today. We have a lot more to cover, so we'll be back right after this.